Story 1. The Whispering Trees. Sarah, Brian, and Jess had planned the perfect weekend, a remote camping trip deep in the Blackwood forest. They'd heard the area was untouched, a hiker's paradise, with no cell service to interrupt the peace. The trio was excited, especially Jess, who'd heard local legends about Blackwood, but they brushed them off as harmless campfire tales. The first day went smoothly. They hiked for miles, following trails that twisted through the dense woods, and found a clearing to set up camp. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, they built a fire, shared some stories, and laughed about how eerie the forest felt after dark. The tall trees seemed to close in, and shadows danced around them. As the night wore on, Brian suggested they sleep early to catch the sunrise. They settled into their tents, but sleep didn't come easily. Sarah tossed and turned, uneasy about the strange noises outside, the rustling of leaves, twigs snapping, and what sounded like whispers carried by the wind. Around midnight, Jess shook Sarah awake. "Do you hear that?" Sarah groggily listened. Faint whispers drifted through the campsite, low and unintelligible. She sat up, heart pounding. Maybe it's the wind. But as they listened more closely, the whispers became clearer, though still hard to comprehend. It sounded like voices, but there were no other camps nearby. Brian woke up, annoyed, and poked his head out of the tent. "It's probably just animals," he muttered, but the uncertainty in his voice betrayed his discomfort. The whispers didn't stop. Around 2 a.m., they all sat by the dying embers of the fire, huddled together. The whispers grew louder. Sarah swore she heard her name among them. "We should leave," she said, her voice trembling. Brian, stubborn as ever, refused to pack up in the middle of the night. "It's just our imagination," he insisted. "We'll go first thing in the morning." But the whispers were relentless. By 4 a.m., they couldn't take it anymore. Jess, pale and shaking, pointed toward the trees. "Look!" Through the thick trunks, shadowy figures moved just at the edge of the firelight. They weren't human, not quite. The shapes slithered between the trees, just out of sight, but their whispers grew deafening. They could feel the presence of something watching them. Without another word, they scrambled to pack their things, leaving most of their gear behind in the panic. They fled the clearing, the forest closing in behind them. As they ran, the whispers followed, surrounding them from all directions. Branches seemed to reach out, snagging their clothes, slowing them down. When they finally reached their car, Jess broke down in tears. None of them could explain what they had heard or seen, but they vowed never to return to Blackwood. A week later, a park ranger found their abandoned campsite, with their tents slashed open and their supplies scattered as if someone or something had searched through them. No other campers have been reported missing since, but those who visit the area often speak of strange voices echoing through the trees at night. Story 2. The Cabin on the Hill. Ben and Laura had been dating for 2 years when they decided to take their first trip together, a weekend hike and camp at a national park known for its scenic trails. They were both avid outdoors people, always up for an adventure, and the park's beauty was renowned. They spent the day hiking along a river, then through the thick forest, eventually reaching a high point where they had a panoramic view of the valley below. That's when Ben spotted it, an old, dilapidated cabin, barely visible through the trees at the top of a distant hill. "That's not on the map," Ben said. "Maybe it's abandoned," Laura suggested. The sun was setting, and they were far from their planned campsite, but curiosity got the better of them. "We can just check it out and head back," Ben said. It took them about 30 minutes to reach the cabin. It was small, with rotting wooden beams and a collapsed roof. The windows were covered with grime, but one stood slightly ajar. Laura hesitated at the door. "We should head back. It's getting dark." Ben, always adventurous, pushed the door open, revealing a small one-room interior. The smell hit them first. Stale and musty, like something had been rotting for years. But the room was empty, save for an old, weathered table in the center, with a single candle on it. What unnerved Laura wasn't the candle, but the footprints in the dust on the floor. They weren't alone. she whispered, gripping his arm. We should go. Now. Ben was about to agree when they both heard a noise behind them, a low creak as if something, or someone, was moving inside the walls. Panic set in. Laura grabbed his hand and bolted out the door. They ran down the hill, not caring where they went, as long as it was away from the cabin. The sun had set completely by the time they stopped running, out of breath and disoriented. That's when they heard it. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching through the underbrush behind them. Someone's following us, Laura whispered, her voice shaky. They darted into the trees, hiding behind a large boulder. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Ben peeked around the rock but saw nothing, just the dark forest. The footsteps stopped. For hours, they sat there, waiting in silence, but whoever, or whatever, had followed them didn't make another sound. At dawn, they gathered their courage and made their way back to the main trail. They didn't see the cabin again, but Laura was sure of one thing. There had been someone, or something in that cabin, and it had followed them down the hill. They never spoke of the trip to anyone else, but years later, Laura still dreams of that night. In the dreams, the cabin isn't abandoned. Someone lives there, watching, waiting for her to come back. Story 3. The Unseen Watcher. Mike and his brother Josh had grown up camping, so a weekend trip to the remote Raven Ridge forest felt like a perfect getaway. They packed light, eager to fish in the pristine lakes and enjoy the untouched wilderness. The first day went off without a hitch. They hiked deep into the forest, finding a perfect spot by the lake to set up camp. The water was crystal clear, and the forest was alive with the sounds of nature. Birds, rustling leaves, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. But as night fell, the forest grew quiet, unnaturally quiet. Around midnight, Mike woke up to the sound of heavy breathing outside their tent. He froze, his heart racing. The sound was too close, just inches from where he lay. He nudged Josh, who groggily opened his eyes. The breathing stopped. "Did you hear that?" Mike whispered. Josh nodded, wide-eyed. They waited, straining to hear, but the sound didn't come back. After an hour, they convinced themselves it had been an animal, maybe a deer passing through, and tried to sleep again. The next morning they found strange tracks circling their tent, large, human-like footprints, but with claws at the toes. They tried to rationalize it, but unease settled in. They decided to pack up and head to a new location just in case. That night, miles from their first campsite, the breathing returned. This time, it was louder, more deliberate. Something or someone was walking around their tent, sniffing the air. They could hear it circling them, its steps slow and heavy. Mike gripped his flashlight, his knuckles white. "We have to go," he whispered. They quietly unzipped the tent and peered out. But the darkness beyond the firelight was impenetrable. Whatever was out there, they couldn't see it, but they could feel it watching them. Gathering their gear as quickly and quietly as possible, they slipped into the forest, their flashlights barely cutting through the thick night. But the breathing followed. No matter how fast they walked, it stayed just out of sight, always pacing them, never revealing itself. By dawn, they reached the park's edge, exhausted and shaken. They didn't know what had stalked them through the forest, but whatever it was, it had been waiting, watching. To this day, Mike and Josh avoid Raven Ridge Forest. Some things, they realized, are better left unseen.